Imagine a world where your midnight snack might be a honey-drenched eel pie, your street food vendor doubles as a tax evader, and your idea of dessert is boiled turnips with molasses. Welcome to the medieval food court, where flavor meets folklore and indigestion meets destiny. Tonight, we journey through the sleepy alleyways of history to uncover the greasy, crumbly, occasionally rat-infested world of medieval junk food. It's a tale of questionable pies, scandalous sausages, and the kind of culinary chaos that makes you grateful for modern refrigeration. So fluff your pillow, loosen your belt, and prepare to be gently bored into blissful slumber by tales of tavern treats, peasant pastries, and noble nosh that was anything but noble. And if this medieval munchfest tickles your turnips, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ringeth thy notification bell, lest ye miss the next episode of Historical Indigestion. Before the pies got suspicious and the sausages started lying, there was bread. Not the fluffy, Instagrammable kind. No, medieval bread was a different beast entirely. Dense, dry, and often doubling as furniture. In the sleepy corners of medieval Europe, bread was more than food. It was a lifestyle, a weapon, a plate, a social statement, and occasionally a mild choking hazard. The bread that could break a tooth. Most peasants munched on black bread, made from rye, barley, or whatever grain hadn't been stolen by rats or taxed by the crown. It was dark, chewy, and had the texture of a philosophical crisis. If you dropped it, it didn't bounce. It dented the floor. The wealthy, meanwhile, enjoyed white bread, made from sifted wheat flour. It was softer, lighter, and came with a side of smugness. But even that wasn't immune to the occasional surprise, like bits of grit from the millstones, which added a crunchy existential twist to every bite. Trencher, the bread that wasn't eaten until it was. Enter the trencher, a thick slab of stale bread used as a plate. Yes, a plate. You'd pile your stew or meat onto it, let the juices soak in, and then either eat it if you were hungry enough, or toss it to the nearest beggar, dog, or rat with a resume. Trenchers were the medieval version of edible tableware. Eco-friendly, yes. Delicious? Debatable. Sleep-inducing? Absolutely. Ye olde bread laws, to prevent bakers from shortchanging customers, medieval towns introduced the assize of bread, a law that regulated the weight and price of loaves. If a baker cheated, they could be fined, shamed, or if the mood struck, paraded through town with a loaf tied around their neck. Imagine being publicly humiliated for underbaking a bun. That's the kind of drama that makes you grateful for modern grocery stores and passive-aggressive Yelp reviews. Bonus ingredients, medieval bread wasn't just flour and water. It was a surprise party in every bite. Depending on the season, you might find bits of straw insects, extra protein, ash from the hearth, the occasional pebble. For texture, it was rustic. It was real. It was the kind of snack that made you chew slowly and question your life choices. Before the invention of fizzy drinks, smoothies, or oat milk lattes, there was ale. Warm, murky, slightly suspicious, and absolutely everywhere. In medieval Europe, ale wasn't just a beverage, it was a lifestyle, a mildly alcoholic hug in a mug, a liquid lullaby for peasants, nobles, and monks alike. And yes, it was technically safer than water, which says more about the water than the ale. Ale. The medieval multitasker. Ale was consumed at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the occasional midnight snack. It was a thirst quencher, a calorie booster, a social lubricant, and occasionally a mild sedative for people who'd had enough turnips for one lifetime. Children drank it, elders drank it, even monks brewed it, though theirs came with extra holiness and possibly fewer rats. The brewing process, sleepy edition, brewing ale, was a cozy, chaotic affair. You'd need barley, or whatever grain hadn't been stolen, water, preferably not from the plague-infested stream, yeast, which no one understood but everyone respected, herbs or spices, if you were fancy or reckless. The result? A cloudy, warm, slightly sour drink that tasted like history and regret. It was served in wooden mugs, clay jugs, or whatever container wasn't currently being used as a chamber pot. And yes, sometimes things fell into the brew. Things like bugs' bits of straw, the occasional shoe, don't ask. But people drank it anyway, because hydration was important, and flavor was negotiable. Alewives, the queens of the brew, in many towns, ale was brewed by alewives, women who turned their homes into sleepy little taverns. They were fierce, flour-dusted, slightly tipsy, and occasionally accused of witchcraft because their ale was too good. Alewives wore tall hats, shouted at customers, and brewed with a passion that bordered on spiritual. Their signs? A broomstick hung outside the door, not for flying, just for sweeping up spilled barley and broken dreams. Tavern snacks. Ale's greasy sidekick. Where there was ale, there were snacks. Greasy, questionable, and deeply comforting. Think eel pies, sausage rolls, mystery meat, skewers, bread trenchers, soaked in stew and sorrow. Taverns were the medieval version of fast food joints. Loud, smoky, and full of people arguing about turnip prices. You'd stumble in, order a mug of ale and a pie that might contain pigeon, and leave with a full belly and mild regret. Before pizza, before kebabs, before the noble chicken nugget, there was eel pie, slippery, greasy, questionable, and somehow beloved. In medieval Europe, eel wasn't just a fish. It was a lifestyle, a squiggly snack that slithered its way into pies, stews, and the occasional scandal. And yes, it was considered junk food, because nothing says comfort cuisine like a pastry filled with aquatic mystery. Why eel? Eels were everywhere. Rivers, moats, puddles, dreams. They were easy to catch, hard to kill, and even harder to explain to your dinner guests. They didn't require fancy tools or noble permission, just a net, a bucket, and the willingness to wrestle something that looked like a wet sock with teeth. And because meat was expensive and fish was holy, eel became the go-to snack for peasants, monks, and anyone who didn't mind their dinner staring back. The pie that slid into history. Eel pie was the medieval equivalent of a hot pocket, fast, filling, and mildly alarming. The recipe: catch eel boil, eel hide eel in pastry, pretend it's delicious. The crust was often made from coarse flour and animal fat, baked until it resembled armor. Inside, a slippery stew of eel chunks, herbs, and whatever else hadn't gone bad yet. It was served in taverns, markets, and roadside stalls, usually with a mug of ale and a side of regret. Eel pie etiquette. Eating eel pie required patience, bravery, and a strong jaw. You'd slice it open, watch the steam rise like a medieval ghost, poke the filling to make sure it wasn't still moving, and then chew slowly, hoping for flavor and praying for forgiveness. Some pies were spiced with pepper, cloves, or cinnamon, exotic ingredients that made the eel taste slightly less like river mud. Others were just eel. Pure, unfiltered, unapologetic eel. Eel pie scandals. Not all eel pies were created equal. Some were made with expired eel, stuffed with mystery meat, sold by vendors who hadn't washed their hands since the last plague. There were rumors of eel pies causing stomach aches, hallucinations, and spontaneous poetry. One monk reportedly ate 3 and began speaking fluent Latin backwards. Coincidence? Perhaps. Delicious? Debatable. Medieval bakers lived in a world of suspicion. If your loaf was too light, too small, or suspiciously hollow, you weren't just disappointing a customer, you were committing a crime against carbs. To combat this, towns introduced the assize of bread and ale, a law so serious it sounds like it was written by a very hungry lawyer. It regulated the weight and price of bread, and if you cheated, you could be fined, shamed, tossed into the pillory, with stale buns hurled at your face, or, in extreme cases, forced to wear your failed loaf like a necklace of shame. Imagine walking through town with a baguette tied around your neck while children chant, "Crumb thief." It was the medieval version of a bad Yelp review, only louder and with more bread-based accessories. The Bakers Guild, ye old carb mafia. To protect their flowery honor, bakers formed guilds, exclusive clubs where you had to prove your doughy worth. These guilds set standards, shared secrets, and occasionally threw parties where the bread was probably still too hard. Joining a guild meant you were a real baker, not just some flour-splattered fraud selling loaves that doubled as doorstops. But even guild members weren't immune to scandal. There were whispers of loaf inflation, adding sawdust to bulk up the dough crumb fraud, selling yesterday's bread as freshly baked yeast theft, stealing sourdough starters like they were medieval gold. It was a crusty underworld, and everyone was watching. The bread testers. To keep things honest, towns appointed bread testers, officials who wandered the streets poking loaves, weighing buns, and occasionally nibbling suspicious slices. Their job was to ensure that bread was heavy enough, honest enough, and not secretly made of sadness and straw. If your loaf failed the test, you could be publicly shamed, fined, or forced to bake 1,000 apology rolls, slowly, with remorse. Bonus loaf ingredients. Again, despite all the rules, medieval bread still had a habit of evolving. Depending on the season, your loaf might include bits of rat fur, unintentional garnish, flecks of ash from enthusiastic hearths, tiny stones for crunch, and the occasional beetle for protein, probably. It was rustic. It was real. It was the kind of bread that made you chew slowly and reflect on your life choices. In the medieval food court of fate, few snacks were as mysterious or as mildly terrifying as the humble sausage, tubular, greasy, occasionally squeaky, and always a gamble. Sausages were the original surprise meal. You never quite knew what was inside, and frankly, you didn't want to. They were the edible equivalent of a sealed scroll, full of secrets, possibly cursed, and best consumed with ale and lowered expectations. The sausage situation. Medieval sausages came in many forms. Blood sausage, made with animal blood, fat, and spices. Comforting if you didn't think too hard. Liver sausage, rich, earthy, and slightly judgmental. Mystery sausage, made with, well, let's just say, whatever was available. They were stuffed into casings made from animal intestines, tied off with string, and hung in smoky kitchens like medieval wind chimes of doom. What's in the sausage? The answer, everything. And sometimes, nothing you wanted. Depending on the vendor's mood and moral compass, your sausage might contain pork, if you were lucky, beef, if you were noble, rat, if you were unlucky, breadcrumbs, herbs, and sawdust, if you were everyone else. It was a culinary roulette wheel. One bite could be bliss. The next, a chewy reminder that food safety wasn't invented yet. Sausage vendors, heroes or villains. Street vendors sold sausages from carts, stalls, and suspicious baskets. They shouted catchy slogans like hot meat, probably legal, stuffed with flavor, and only mild regret. Buy one, get a stomachache free. These vendors were beloved and feared. They fed the masses, fueled tavern gossip, and occasionally disappeared after a particularly chewy batch. Some were honest, others were creative. There were tales of sausages made from spoiled meat, disguised with extra pepper sausages that squeaked when bitten. No one knows why. Sausages that caused vivid dreams of dancing turnips. And yet, people kept buying them because they were cheap, filling, and vaguely comforting, like a hug from someone wearing too much perfume. Sausage laws. Yes, really. To prevent total chaos, some towns introduced meat regulations. Inspectors would weigh sausages, sniff sausages, occasionally poke them with sticks, and sigh dramatically. If a vendor was caught selling fake meat, they could be fined, banned, or forced to eat their own inventory. Slowly, with remorse, in the medieval world of mud, mystery meat, and mildly haunted pies, dessert was a rare and wondrous thing, not elegant, not refined, but sweet enough to make peasants pause, nobles swoon, and monks quietly hum Gregorian hymns of joy. Tonight, we explore the sleepy realm of medieval sweets, where honey reigned supreme, fruit was dried like ancient secrets, and sugar was so rare it was basically treasure. Honey, the OG sweetener. Before sugar took over the world, honey was the golden goo of choice. It was sticky sacred, and occasionally stolen by bears or monks pretending to be bears. Honey was drizzled over bread, mixed into porridge, and used to disguise the taste of things that probably shouldn't have been eaten. It was the medieval equivalent of ketchup, if ketchup were made by bees and worshipped by poets. Fruit, but make it sad. Fresh fruit was seasonal, expensive, and often bruised, so people dried it, slowly, dramatically, like they were preparing it for a medieval soap opera. Common dried fruits included figs, chewy and judgmental, dates, imported and smug, raisins, the official snack of monks and mildly disappointed children. These were mixed into puddings, pies, and mysterious confections that looked like they'd been invented during a thunderstorm. Sweetbreads and questionable cakes. Medieval cakes weren't fluffy, they were dense, heavy, philosophical, made with coarse flour, honey, and the occasional splash of ale. They resembled bricks with ambition. Sweetbreads were often baked for festivals, weddings, or moments of existential crisis. They were decorated with nuts, dried fruit, and sometimes feathers, for flair or confusion. Sugar, the forbidden crystal. Sugar existed, but only for the rich, the royal, and the reckless. It was imported from faraway lands, stored like treasure, and used sparingly, very sparingly. A spoonful of sugar could sweeten a dish, impress a guest, or bankrupt a small village. It was used in medicinal syrups, fancy desserts, and love potions that mostly caused sneezing. Medieval pudding, the sweet that wasn't. Pudding in medieval times was a confusing concept. It could be sweet if you were lucky, savory if you were not, or made entirely of meat and oats if someone misunderstood the assignment. Sweet puddings were rare, often made with milk, honey, and breadcrumbs. They were boiled, baked, or forgotten in a corner until someone remembered dessert was a thing. Not every medieval meal was served in a smoky tavern or beneath a chandelier made of antlers. Sometimes food was eaten in the fields, on a rock, next to a goat, and sometimes it was mostly turnips. Welcome to the humble world of peasant picnics, where the snacks were simple, the bread was judgmental, and the vibe was mildly grateful to be alive. The peasant lunchbox. Peasants didn't have lunchboxes. They had bundles, wrapped in cloth, tied with string, occasionally gnawed on by squirrels. Inside, you might find a chunk of black bread, stale, noble, possibly weaponized, a wedge of cheese, harder than your boss's heart, a boiled egg, if the chickens were feeling generous, and of course the ever-present turnip, raw, roasted, or resigned. It wasn't glamorous, but it was food, and it didn't bite back. Usually, turnips, the root of all sleepiness. Turnips were the backbone of the peasant diet. They were cheap, plentiful, and emotionally neutral. You could boil them, mash them, roast them, or stare at them until they blinked. They were the medieval version of tofu. Versatile, bland, and slightly suspicious. Some peasants tried to spice things up by adding a drizzle of honey if they hadn't traded it for socks, a sprinkle of herbs if they hadn't been trampled by cows, or a dash of hope, which was always in short supply. But mostly, it was just turnips and silence, picnic companions. Peasant picnics weren't solo affairs. You'd eat with fellow field workers, curious livestock, that one guy who always brought fermented cabbage and opinions. There were no napkins, no cutlery, just fingers, teeth, and the occasional stick used for stirring, sharing, or defending your cheese. Conversation topics included, how stale is your bread today? Do you think the Lord knows we exist? Is this turnip looking at me funny? It was rustic. It was real. It was the kind of meal that made you chew slowly and dream of dessert, or at least a softer vegetable, the joy of not starving. Despite the simplicity, peasant picnics had their charm. You were outside, you were fed, you weren't being chased by geese, and sometimes someone would bring a surprise, like a dried fig, a slice of onion, or a story about a sausage that changed their life. It was community. It was survival. It was mildly edible. In the medieval culinary battlefield, few foods were as bold, brash, and occasionally belligerent as cheese. It wasn't just a snack. It was a statement, a fermented fist bump from the dairy gods, and sometimes it squeaked. Tonight, we unwrap the sleepy saga of medieval cheese, where texture was a weapon, flavor was a dare, and aging was less a process and more a personality trait. Cheese, the medieval mood. Cheese came in many forms. Hard cheese, aged until it could double as a building material. Soft cheese, gooey, fragrant, and slightly judgmental. Fresh cheese, made quickly, eaten faster, and often shared with suspicious enthusiasm. It was made from cow's milk, goat's milk, sheep's milk, and occasionally, whatever, wandered into the barn and looked vaguely milkable. The cheese-making process, sleepy edition. Making cheese was a slow, dreamy ritual. You'd need milk, preferably not stolen, rennet, from a calf's stomach, because medieval cuisine loved a twist, salt, to keep the demons out, thyme, and a cool corner of the cellar that didn't smell like regret. The result? A wheel of cheese that could feed a family, start a feud, or be used as currency in very niche markets. Cheese storage. The moldy truth, medieval cheese wasn't refrigerated. It was aged in cellars, hung from rafters, or buried in straw. It developed rinds that could stop arrows, mold that looked like ancient maps, smells that inspired poetry and mild panic. Some cheeses were so strong they were banned from certain monasteries. Others were so mild they were used as pillows. Okay, maybe just once. Cheese crimes and dairy. Drama cheese was valuable, which meant cheese theft. There were tales of monks sneaking wheels out of abbey kitchens, peasants hiding cheese in haystacks, nobles bribing servants with wedges of illicit Gouda. One particularly sleepy village had a cheese watch, a group of elderly men who sat by the market and sniffed suspicious wheels. Their motto? If it stinks, it's ours. Cheese pairings, medieval style. Cheese was rarely eaten alone. It was paired with bread, stale, noble, emotionally distant. Onions, raw, aggressive, and proud. Al, warm, murky, and mildly apologetic. Together, they formed the holy trinity of peasant snacking, a meal that filled the belly, fogged the mind, and occasionally inspired interpretive dance. In the medieval snackiverse, few foods were as persistent, pungent, and profoundly misunderstood as dried fish. It was the protein bar of the past, the jerky of the monastery, the snack that smelled like it had opinions. Tonight, we unwrap the sleepy saga of medieval fishy treats, where salt was king, freshness was optional, and flavor was a distant cousin who rarely visited. The fish that refused to leave fish was everywhere. Rivers, lakes, moats, dreams. And thanks to religious fasting rules, it was eaten often, especially when meat was banned, but loopholes were encouraged. Popular fishy snacks included dried herring, chewy, salty, and emotionally distant, smoked eel, slippery, mysterious, and slightly judgmental, salted cod, the medieval version of a protein slab with a personality. These were preserved with salt, smoke, or sheer stubbornness. They lasted for weeks, sometimes months, occasionally until someone asked, "Is this still food?" The preservation process, sleepy addition. To keep fish edible-ish, medieval folks used salt, lots of it, enough to make your tongue reconsider its career, smoke, from fires, hearths, and occasionally angry villagers, drying racks, wooden frames where fish hung like laundry, flapping gently in the breeze of mild regret. The result, a snack that was tough, tangy, and capable of surviving a siege, a pilgrimage, or a particularly long sermon. Fish markets, the smell of commerce. Medieval fish markets were lively, loud, and deeply aromatic. Vendors shouted things like, "Fresh-ish herring," "Cod that's only mildly haunted," "Buy 2 eels, get a free existential crisis." Fish was sold whole, filleted, or disguised as something else entirely. Prices fluctuated based on seasoned smell, whether the fish had recently blinked. And yes, there were scandals. Fish swapped for frogs. Eels dyed to look like trout. One vendor famously sold a boot stuffed with anchovies and called it Sea Surprise. Fish and religion, a holy snack. Thanks to fasting laws, fish became the go-to loophole. Monks ate it, nobles tolerated it, Peasants pretended it was meat and hoped no one noticed. On Fridays, holy days, and moments of spiritual confusion, fish was served with bread, still stale, ale, still warm, and prayers for flavor. Some monasteries even had fish ponds, quiet, sleepy places where monks whispered to trout and occasionally named them. Fish pairings, medieval style. Fish was rarely eaten alone. It came with mustard, spicy and suspicious, vinegar, sharp and judgmental, onions, raw and emotionally volatile. Together, they formed a meal that was bold, briny, and slightly confrontational. In the salty underbelly of medieval cuisine, one fish ruled them all. Not the eel, not the herring, not the trout with trust issues. No, this was cod, the dried, salted, slightly smug monarch of medieval munching. Tonight, we meet the codfather, a fish so powerful, so portable, so profoundly chewy, it became the backbone of trade, fasting, and questionable stew. Cod, the snack that refused to die. Cod wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. Caught in cold northern waters, dried on racks like fishy laundry, and salted until it could survive a Viking raid. Cod was durable, transportable, and emotionally unavailable. It was shipped across Europe, traded for spices, and occasionally used as a doorstop. Some pieces were so dry, they required soaking for days before they remembered they were edible. The drying process, cod spa edition. To preserve cod, medieval folks split it open like a scroll of destiny, salted it until it wept, hung it on wooden racks to dry in the wind, sun, and occasional existential dread. The result, a slab of fish that could last for months, survive a pilgrimage, and be used to settle minor disputes. Cod was so tough, it was said that one knight used a dried fillet as a shield. He lost the battle, but the cod survived. Cod cuisine, a sleepy affair, once rehydrated, with patience, prayer, and possibly a small lake. Cod was cooked in stews, with onions, herbs, and hope, pies, where it pretended to be meat, porridge, don't ask, or simply boiled until it gave up. It was served with mustard, vinegar, or a side of, please don't make me eat this again. But it filled bellies. It followed fasting rules, and it didn't bite back. Cod and religion, a holy alliance. Because meat was banned on many religious days, cod became the snack of saints. Monks loved it. Priests tolerated it. Peasants pretended it was chicken and moved on. Cod was considered pious, practical, and only mildly cursed. It was eaten in monasteries, castles, and roadside stalls, where the fish had names and possibly opinions. Cod economics, the fish that paid rent. Cod wasn't just food. It was currency. It was traded for grain ale horses, and, in one legendary tale, a small castle with plumbing issues. Cod merchants were powerful. Cod smugglers were sneaky. Cod eaters were everywhere. And yes, there were cod cartels, secret societies of fishmongers who met in damp basements and whispered about salt ratios. If you wandered through a medieval town square with a few coins and a questionable appetite, you'd find yourself in the chaotic embrace of street food. It was fast, it was greasy, it was mildly suspicious, and it came with a side of gossip, grit, and the occasional plague's rat. Tonight, we stroll through the sleepy cobblestone alleys of medieval street cuisine, where pies were mysterious, puddings were philosophical, and vendors had more secrets than seasoning. The medieval food court street food stalls popped up wherever people gathered. Markets, festivals, executions, Yes, and church steps. Vendors shouted catchy slogans like hot pie, possibly edible, stew with fewer regrets, buy one pudding, get a free existential crisis. The air was thick with smoke, spice, and the unmistakable scent of something that had been boiled for too long. Pies of questionable origin, the most popular street snack, meat pies. They were small, portable, and deeply mysterious inside the flaky crust, which was often more armor than pastry. You might find pork, if you were lucky, pigeon, if you were brave, rat, if you were lied to, or a blend of don't ask, just chew. Pie vendors were known for their speed, their charm, and their ability to disappear when someone asked for a receipt. Puddings, that puzzled medieval puddings, weren't sweet, they were savory, dense, slightly confrontational, made with oats, blood, herbs, and the occasional regret. They were boiled in cloth bags and served with a spoon carved from guilt. Some puddings were so chewy, they were used as stress toys. Others were so spicy, they inspired poetry. And yet, people kept eating them because they were warm, filling, and cheaper than therapy. Vendor vibes. Street food vendors were a colorful bunch. The shouting pie man with a cart that squeaked. The mysterious pudding lady who may or may not have been a wizard. The fish stick boy who sold dried herring and unsolicited advice. They operated on charm, speed, and plausible deniability. If someone got sick, they'd vanish for a week and return with a new hat and a slightly different accent. Snack laws and crumb crimes. To keep things mildly legal, towns introduced snack regulations. Inspectors would weigh pies, sniff puddings, ask vendors, "Is this meat?" and receive a shrug in response. If caught selling fake food, vendors could be fined, shamed, or forced to eat their own inventory while apologizing in verse. In the modern world, pudding is a creamy delight, sweet, smooth, and occasionally chocolate flavored. In medieval times, pudding was a trap. It was savory, it was lumpy, it was deeply confusing, and it often contained meat. Tonight, we unravel the sleepy mystery of medieval pudding, where oats met offal, cloth bags replaced baking pans, and dessert was a distant dream. What even was pudding? Medieval pudding wasn't a dish. It was a concept. It could be boiled, baked, stuffed into intestines, or tied up in cloth and dunked in a cauldron like a culinary hostage. There were black puddings, white puddings, oat puddings, and blood puddings. None of them were sweet. All of them were suspicious. Ingredients of mild alarm. A typical medieval pudding might include oats for texture, fat for flavor, blood for drama, herbs for plausible deniability, and meat scraps for reasons. It was mixed into a paste, stuffed into a casing or cloth, and boiled until it resembled something edible, or at least chewable. Some puddings were so dense they could be used as doorstops. Others were so spicy they caused spontaneous poetry. The cloth bag method forget baking pans. Medieval cooks used linen bags. They'd spoon the pudding mixture into the cloth, tie it off with string, and boil it in a pot until it stopped resisting. The result? A lumpy, moist, vaguely tubular snack that could be sliced, fried, or thrown at someone who insulted your turnips. And yes, sometimes the cloth leaked, which meant your pudding came with a side of textile. Pudding scandals and culinary confusion. Because pudding was so flexible and so poorly defined, it led to pudding fraud, vendors selling porridge and calling it pudding, pudding theft, monks sneaking extra slices during Lent, pudding panic. One noble reportedly fainted after discovering raisins in his blood pudding. There were no rules, just vibes and steam. Pudding pairings, medieval style. Pudding was served with ale to forget, bread to soak up the emotional damage, onions because why not, and occasionally mustard for chaos. It was eaten at feasts, fairs, and funerals. It was comfort food for people who had never met comfort, while peasants gnawed on turnips and monks whispered to trout. The nobility dined like they were auditioning for a food-themed opera. Their snacks were extravagant. Their portions were absurd. Their digestion, questionable. Tonight, we tiptoe into the gilded halls of medieval royalty, where junk food wore a crown, swans were served with syrup, and indigestion was a badge of honor. The royal snack table. Medieval nobles didn't snack like common folk. They feasted. Even their light bites involved roasted peacock with feathers reattached for drama, stuffed dormice, tiny, tragic, and oddly crunchy, candied rose petals, because flowers should be edible and confusing, and pies shaped like castles, filled with questionable ambition. These weren't meals. They were spectacles, served on gold platters, announced by trumpets, and occasionally followed by fainting. The swan situation swans were the ultimate status snack. Not because they tasted good, they didn't, but because they were elegant, expensive, and mildly aggressive. Roasted swan was often glazed with honey, stuffed with herbs, and presented with its neck arched in judgment. It was the medieval version of saying, "I'm rich, and I eat birds that hiss." Some nobles preferred crane, heron, or parrot, though the latter was mostly decorative and prone to swearing. Meat, meat, and more meat royal. Tables overflowed with venison, deer, but make it dramatic. Boar, angry pig with a backstory. Rabbit, served in pies, stews, and moral dilemmas. And occasionally, hedgehog, don't ask. Meat was roasted, spiced, glazed, and stacked like edible architecture. Vegetables were present, but mostly ignored, like interns at a royal banquet. Dessert, the noble sweet tooth. Royal desserts were elaborate, sticky, and mildly terrifying. Think marzipan sculptures of mythical beasts, jellied fruits shaped like castles, sugar-coated almonds served in goblets of confusion. Sugar was rare and expensive, so nobles flaunted it like edible jewelry. One queen reportedly had a sugar crown. It melted. She cried. History moved on. Indigestion and medical mayhem. With all this feasting came consequences. Nobles suffered from heartburn, gout, meat sweats, a term I just invented but feels historically accurate. Medieval doctors prescribed leech therapy, herbal tonics, and long walks in gardens, while regretting the third swan. If medieval nobles were good at one thing, it was overdoing dinner. Feasts weren't just meals. They were theatrical productions, with meat-based plot twists, musical interludes, and the occasional fainting guest. Tonight, we pull up a velvet chair at the royal banquet table, where the food was endless, the pacing was non-existent, and indigestion was practically a party favor. The banquet begins. A proper medieval feast began with trumpets to announce the arrival of soup, jesters to distract from the smell of boiled boar, and servants carrying platters so heavy they developed philosophical views on poultry. The first course might include spiced wine, warm, sweet, and slightly judgmental, bread trenchers, still stale, still emotionally distant, and a light salad made of herbs, flowers, and confusion. Then came the meat, and more meat, and then a meat pie shaped like a dragon. The pace of excess? Feasts could last hours, sometimes days. There were no breaks, no intermissions, just wave after wave of roasted venison, glazed swan, stuffed goose-boiled beef, and a mysterious dish called frumenti, which was basically porridge with ambition. Guests were expected to eat, nod politely, and occasionally pretend they weren't sweating through their tunics. The entertainment between chews. Between courses, guests were treated to minstrels singing about turnips, dancers dressed as vegetables, trained bears, not always trained, and one memorable performance where a man juggled pies and existential dread. It was festive. It was chaotic. It was the kind of evening that made you question your relationship with poultry. The aftermath. By the end of the feast, guests were bloated, dazed, and quietly whispering prayers to Saint Antacid. Some nobles were carried out. Others simply rolled. One duke reportedly fell asleep in a pudding and was declared spiritually full. Doctors were summoned. Herbal tonics were brewed, and the leftovers were fed to dogs, peasants, or buried in the garden as a warning. The digestive rituals. To recover, nobles drank mint wine, fennel tea, or a mysterious tonic called dragon's breath, which was mostly vinegar and regret. They walked in circles, sighed dramatically, and vowed never to eat swan again until the next feast, which was scheduled for Tuesday. Not every medieval meal was served on a golden platter beneath a chandelier made of antlers. Sometimes food was eaten in the fields, on a rock, next to a goat, and sometimes it was mostly turnips. Tonight, we return to the humble world of peasant picnics, where the snacks were simple, the bread was judgmental, and the vibe was mildly grateful to be alive. The peasant lunch ensemble. Peasants didn't have lunch boxes. They had bundles, wrapped in cloth, tied with string, occasionally gnawed on by squirrels. Inside, you might find a chunk of black bread, stale, noble, possibly weaponized, a wedge of cheese, harder than your landlord's heart, a boiled egg, if the chickens were feeling generous, and of course, the ever-present turnip, raw, roasted, or resigned. It wasn't glamorous, but it was food, and it didn't bite back. Usually, turnips, the root of all sleepiness. Turnips were the backbone of the peasant diet. They were cheap, plentiful, and emotionally neutral. You could boil them, mash them, roast them, or stare at them until they blinked. They were the medieval version of tofu. Versatile, bland, and slightly suspicious. Some peasants tried to spice things up by adding a drizzle of honey if they hadn't traded it for socks, a sprinkle of herbs if they hadn't been trampled by cows, or a dash of hope, which was always in short supply. But mostly, it was just turnips and silence. Picnic companions. Peasant picnics weren't solo affairs. You'd eat with fellow field workers, curious livestock, that one guy who always brought fermented cabbage and opinions. There were no napkins, no cutlery, just fingers, teeth, and the occasional stick used for stirring, sharing, or defending your cheese. Conversation topics included, how stale is your bread today? Do you think the Lord knows we exist? Is this turnip looking at me funny? It was rustic. It was real. It was the kind of meal that made you chew slowly and dream of dessert, or at least a softer vegetable, the joy of not starving. Despite the simplicity, Peasant picnics had their charm. You were outside, you were fed, you weren't being chased by geese. And sometimes, someone would bring a surprise, like a dried fig, a slice of onion, or a story about a sausage that changed their life. It was community. It was survival. It was mildly edible. In the medieval world, food wasn't just eaten, it was regulated. Even snacks had rules. Even crumbs had consequences. And yes, there were actual laws about how much bread you could sell before someone threw you in a pillory. Tonight, we tiptoe through the sleepy scrolls of medieval food law, where bakers feared inspectors, pies were weighed like gold, and snack-related crimes were surprisingly common. The assize of bread, ye olde carb, Constitution. One of the earliest food laws was the assize of bread and ale, a regulation so serious it sounds like it was written by a very hungry lawyer. It dictated the weight of bread loaves, the price based on grain cost, the punishment for shortchanging customers. Spoiler, it involved public humiliation. If your loaf was too light, too small, or suspiciously hollow, you could be fined, shamed, or paraded through town with a stale bun tied around your neck, like a necklace of regret. It was the medieval version of a bad Yelp review, only louder and with more bread-based accessories. Ale laws, frothy justice. Ale wasn't safe either. Brewers had to follow strict rules about strength, too weak, fraud, too strong a power party, price, based on barley cost and local mood swings, cleanliness, which was mostly theoretical. Alewives, those fierce women who brewed and sold ale, were often inspected by officials known as ale conners, who would taste the ale, judge its quality, and occasionally sit on a bench made of sticky ale-soaked bread to test its absorbency. Yes, really. If the ale failed, the brewer could be fined, banned, or forced to drink their own inventory while apologizing in verse. Pie crimes and pudding perils. Street vendors selling pies, puddings, and mystery meat were watched closely. If caught, using spoiled ingredients, faking meat with turnips, or selling pies that squeaked when bitten, they could be fined, banished from the market, or forced to eat their own pie while being serenaded by a disappointed minstrel. There were even official pie inspectors, whose job was to poke pastries and ask, "Is this meat?" while maintaining eye contact. Snack surveillance markets had food wardens, crumb counters, and stew sniffers. Their job? To keep snacks honest. Their tools? Scales, scrolls, and a deep sense of suspicion. They'd wander the stalls, weigh loaves, sniff sausages, and occasionally confiscate pies that looked too cheerful. One town reportedly banned pudding for a week after a vendor sold one that caused spontaneous dancing. Snack taxes, the price of flavor. Food wasn't free. Vendors paid taxes on bread, ale, cheese, and even turnips, though turnip tax evasion was rampant. These taxes funded roads, churches, and the occasional royal feast where nobles ate swans and forgot peasants existed. If the medieval street was the snack stall of chaos, the tavern was its greasy, gossip-soaked heart. It was loud. It was smoky. It smelled like ale, onions, and ambition. And it served food that could comfort your soul or confuse your stomach. Tonight, we stumble into the sleepy world of medieval taverns, where the ale flowed, the sausages squeaked, and the gossip was hotter than the stew. The tavern vibe. Taverns were the medieval version of your favorite dive bar, minus the neon signs, and plus a few goats. They were dimly lit, loudly argued in, and filled with people who had strong opinions about turnips. You'd enter through a creaky door, dodge a lute player, and find a seat next to someone who smelled like boiled cabbage and dreams. The menu: comfort meets chaos. Tavern food was hearty, greasy, and served with a shrug. Popular items included eel pie, still slippery, still suspicious; sausage rolls, contents negotiable; stew, a bubbling mystery of meat, root vegetables, and mild regret; bread trenchers, used as plates, then eaten, then regretted. The ale was warm, the cheese was bold, the onions were raw and emotionally volatile, and if you asked what was in the pie, the cook would wink and say, mostly edible. Gossip on tap taverns weren't just for eating, they were for talking. You'd hear tales of a knight who challenged a goose to a duel, a baker caught selling sawdust buns, a monk who brewed ale so strong it converted a squirrel. Everyone had a story. Most were exaggerated. Some were whispered. A few were sung by minstrels with questionable pitch. And yes, there were debates, loud ones, about whether pudding should contain meat, if turnips were secretly noble, and whether the pie vendor down the street was a wizard. Tavern staff, heroes of hospitality. Behind the counter stood the tavern keeper, a master of multitasking, sarcasm, and mild threats. They served food, broke up fights, and occasionally performed impromptu marriage ceremonies. The cook was usually covered in flour, muttering to a pot, and wearing a hat that had seen things together. They kept the tavern running, the food flowing, and the gossip spicy. The aftermath. After a night of greasy snacks and ale-fueled storytelling, patrons would stumble home, sleep in the stables, or wake up next to a wheel of cheese and a new nickname. Some taverns offered beds, others offered hay. One famously offered a pillow made of stale bread. In the shadowy corners of medieval cuisine, one dish stirred more confusion, controversy, and culinary chaos than any other: pudding. It was boiled, it was bagged, it was beloved, and according to some, it was part of a conspiracy. Tonight, we unravel the sleepy scandal of the Great Pudding Conspiracy, where monks whispered, vendors vanished, and one pudding may or may not have caused a minor uprising. The pudding that started it all. It began with a cloth bag. Inside, oats, sweet, herbs, and a suspicious amount of dried fruit. Outside, a vendor named Elric, who claimed his pudding could heal heartbreak and repel rats. People lined up. They chewed. They nodded politely. Then someone asked, "Is this pudding magical?" Elric winked. The crowd gasped. A monk fainted. History was set in motion. The rise of pudding. Panic. Soon, rumors spread. Elric's pudding cured gout. Elric's pudding summoned rain. Elric's pudding contained no meat, which was both revolutionary and mildly illegal. Other vendors grew jealous. Monks grew suspicious. The town council convened a snack tribunal, which was exactly as dramatic as it sounds. They demanded a full ingredient list, a pudding demonstration, and a taste test conducted by a blindfolded goat named Gregory sneezed. The pudding was declared spiritually ambiguous. Elric was fined 3 turnips and told to boil with caution the secret ingredient. Whispers emerged of a forbidden spice, imported from distant lands, capable of making pudding taste like joy. Some said it was cinnamon. Others said it was nutmeg. One bard claimed it was the tears of a disappointed baker. Whatever it was, Elric denied everything, but his puddings kept selling, and one noble reportedly ate 5 in a row and began speaking fluent goose. The pudding trials. Other vendors tried to replicate the recipe. They failed. One pudding exploded. Another turned green. A third was so chewy, it was used as a doorstop in the local abbey. The snack tribunal returned, this time with spoons. They declared, "Let pudding be pudding. Let mystery be flavor. Let Elric pay his taxes." And with that, the conspiracy faded into legend. Pudding legacy. Today, Elric's pudding lives on in bedtime stories, tavern songs, and one particularly confusing mural. It's remembered as the pudding that defied definition, the snack that sparked a movement, and the dish that made a goat sneeze in front of royalty. Far from the noisy taverns and crumb crimes of the town square, nestled behind stone walls and suspiciously quiet gardens, lay the medieval monastery, a place of prayer, peace, and, surprisingly, snacks. Tonight, we tiptoe into the sleepy sanctum of monastic cuisine, where monks brewed ale, aged cheese, and occasionally committed culinary heresy in the name of flavor. The monastic meal plan. Monks followed strict schedules: prayer, work, silence, and food. Their meals were simple, humble, and deeply contemplative. Think porridge, thick, beige, and emotionally distant. Bread, still stale, still holy. Vegetables, boiled into submission. And on special days, cheese, glorious, mysterious cheese. They ate in silence, seated in long rows, occasionally nodding at a particularly well-boiled turnip. The cheese that knew things. Monastic cheese wasn't just food. It was legend, made in cool cellars, aged in silence, and wrapped in cloth like a sacred relic. It was sharp, dense, and possibly sentient. Some cheeses were so strong they were banned from the chapel. Others were so mild they were used to bribe visiting bishops. One monastery reportedly had a wheel of cheese that whistled when sliced. The monks called it Brother Brie. It was never explained. Ale and quiet rebellion. Despite vows of simplicity, monks brewed excellent ale. It was warm, murky, and strong enough to make a goose recite scripture. They used secret recipes, passed down through generations, involving herbs, honey, and possibly divine intervention. Monks drank in moderation, except Brother Cedric, who once drank 3 mugs and tried to baptize a turnip. Snack time in the cloister. Between prayers, monks snacked on. Dried fruit, figs, dates, and raisins with spiritual depth. Nuts, cracked with solemnity. Honey cakes, rare, revered, and slightly sticky. And cheese slices served on bread trenchers that doubled as bookmarks. They didn't gossip, they didn't argue, but they did occasionally trade snacks under the table, like medieval lunchroom rebels. Culinary contraband. Not all monastic snacks were approved. There were tales of secret sausage stashes, unauthorized pudding experiments, and one monk who smuggled cinnamon into the abbey and was exiled to the herb garden. Food was sacred, but flavor was tempting, and sometimes temptation won. And so, dear listener, we arrive at the final course, the last crumb, the ultimate snack showdown, a sleepy tale of culinary competition, questionable ingredients, and one monk who brought pudding to a sword fight. Tonight, we drift into the dreamlike chaos of the great medieval munch-off, a fictional but entirely plausible food contest where peasants, nobles, monks, and tavern cooks battled for snack supremacy. The setup, a feast for the ages. It began with a proclamation. Let all who stir, stew, roast, or regret gather for the munch-off. Held in the town square, beneath fluttering banners, and the watchful gaze of a goat named Harold, the contest welcomed. Alewives with bubbling brews, pie vendors with flaky ambition, monks with cheese aged in silence, peasants with turnips carved into swans, and one noble who arrived with a roasted hedgehog wearing a crown. The rules were simple. Make a snack, present it with flair. Try not to poison the judges. The contest begins. First up, Brother Cedric's Holy Cheese Wheel, aged for 12 years, smelled like enlightenment, served with a side of Gregorian chanting and mild hallucinations. Next, Elric's legendary pudding, boiled in a bag, stuffed with secrets. Judges nodded, wept, and one briefly levitated. Then, Lady Mildred's swan on a stick, glazed with honey, decorated with edible feathers, tasted like ambition and regret. And finally, Turnip Trio by Peasant Pete Raw, roasted and mashed, served with a poem and a spoon carved from fence wood. The judging panel, the judges included, a retired knight with indigestion, a bard who only spoke in rhymes, and Harold the goat, who nibbled everything and sneezed dramatically. They scored dishes based on flavor, presentation, emotional impact, and whether the snack made them question reality. The winner, after much chewing, sighing, and interpretive dancing, the winner was declared everyone, because in the end, medieval junk food wasn't about perfection. It was about survival, creativity, and the joy of sharing something warm, weird, and possibly edible. The crowd cheered. The pies were passed around. Brother Cedric hugged his cheese. Harold sneezed again. And as the sun set over the cobblestones, the town drifted into a gentle food coma. You've journeyed through 20 chapters of medieval munching, through crusty bread, slippery eel pies, sausage scandals, pudding conspiracies, and noble noshing. You've met monks who whispered to cheese, peasants who picnicked with turnips, and vendors who sold snacks with a wink and a prayer. And now, dear, it's time to rest. So fluff your pillow. Let the scent of honeyed swan and ale-soaked trenchers fade into dreams. And remember, in the medieval world, even the weirdest snack had a story. Thank you for feasting with me. Good night.